For nearly 2 decades, Martin Wallace avoided walking anywhere near the old cemetery of Pine Hollow. Even when he drove past the road that curved around the hill, he'd turn his eyes away, as if afraid that something or someone was still waiting for him behind those rusted gates. He never spoke about it. His wife, his neighbors, the guys at the bar, everyone knew something had happened in there, but no one dared to ask. It wasn't until the death of his wife, Helen, that Martin was forced to return. It was a cool November morning when the caretaker, Mr. Jenkins, opened the gate without saying a word. The air reeked of damp soil and decaying flowers. Martin felt his chest tighten before even stepping through the threshold. He wore a worn-out hat and carried a face carved by time's indifference. But in his eyes, there was something deeper than age, something left unfinished. They chose a quiet corner far from the old walnut tree, the same tree where, years ago, Martin had witnessed something that made him walk away from everything. That day, as Helen's casket was lowered into the ground, Martin kept his eyes shut. He didn't want to see whether that shadow was still there, but memory has no respect for silence. The moment the priest finished the blessing, that same distant whisper that had haunted his sleepless nights returned to him. "Help me." That night, alone in the living room with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, Martin opened a notebook. He wasn't a writer, not even close, but he had to pour out what was slowly eating him alive. What he lived through wasn't something you make up, not a tale for drunkards. It was real and it was his. If he didn't speak now, he knew it would follow him to the grave. So if you're listening to this, if stories like this captivate you, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments about the worst experience you've ever had in your life. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another story. It's the truth Martin carried for years, a truth that began one unbearably hot night in the heart of the cemetery, just when he thought nothing could scare him anymore. Even though the town had changed, dirt roads paved, streetlights installed, Martin knew some things didn't care about time. Some presences linger because they never finished what they came to do. That quiet, cold certainty was what forced him to write. And writing was the only way he survived what was coming back. During his years as night guard, Martin had walked every inch of Pine Hollow Memorial. He knew where the oldest tombstones stood, the muddy paths that formed after storms, even the brittle sound of dry branches rustling in the wind. He wasn't a man who scared easily. He slept little, ate modestly, and worked with a flashlight that failed more often than it worked. Yet he had never felt what he felt that night. It was mid-January, the air thick and clinging to the skin like grease. Martin was on his usual patrol, transistor radio strapped to his belt, shirt soaked in sweat. 20 minutes before midnight, he neared the walnut tree. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was an animal, a faint whimper like a wounded cat. But after 2 more steps, he realized it was something else entirely. The sound came from the direction of the grave where, just days before, they'd buried a young woman named Rachel Monroe. The story had spread fast. Sudden death, right before her wedding. The coffin had arrived with her dressed in white, veil still covering her face. The family cried so much that no one paid attention to the details, but Martin did. He remembered the wilted flowers and the clinging humidity that never seemed to lift. That night, as he heard the sobbing, part of him hesitated, but habit pushed him forward. He aimed his flashlight and stepped cautiously. As the beam reached the base of the walnut tree, he froze. Someone was standing there, a pale figure, still, silent, a woman. Her gown touched the ground, stained with dry mud. The veil covered her face, but Martin knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones, that she was looking straight at him. She said nothing. Only that same muffled, aching sob echoed softly, as if rising from the dirt itself. As he turned to retreat, she lifted her head, and without moving her lips, a voice brushed his ear. "Help me." He didn't scream, didn't ask, didn't think. He dropped the flashlight, spun around, and ran. Didn't look back, Didn't close the gate, didn't even grab the radio, he just ran. When morning came, he was still sitting in front of the cemetery, clutching his mother's rosary between his fingers. And when someone asked what had happened, all he said, over and over, was, "She's not from here." That was the last night Martin Wallace ever set foot in that graveyard, until death made him return. News of Martin's sudden resignation spread quickly in Pine Hollow. It wasn't normal for someone to abandon a stable job overnight, especially someone like him, quiet, methodical. Some figured he'd gotten sick, others whispered about fear, though no one knew exactly what he was afraid of. Martin said nothing, just packed his things and vanished from the cemetery like he'd never been there at all. But in small towns, silence speaks loud. People started connecting the dots. The sudden death of Rachel Monroe, the bride who collapsed the day of her wedding, was a tragedy the town struggled to accept. Some said it was her heart. Others claimed she fainted from shock when the groom arrived late. The most common version insisted she passed out at the church entrance and never woke up. One thing was certain, she was buried in her wedding dress. White casket, wilted flowers, veil over her face, details etched in the memory of many. An elderly woman who lived across from the church swore she heard the mother screaming, begging someone to wake her up, saying she couldn't have died like that, so suddenly. That's when the whispers started. A neighbor said her dog refused to go near the cemetery road. A child claimed to see a lady in a wedding dress behind the gate. Others reported footsteps or faint music at dawn. No one had proof, but everyone began avoiding the area after 6 p.m. Father Julian, the local priest, was asked about it more than once. He always gave vague answers, saying souls need peace, and it's unwise to speak lightly of the dead. Still, he himself stopped walking the grounds like he used to, especially after dark. The town tried hiring a new night guard. No one took the job. One young man initially agreed, but backed out the same night without explanation. Some believed it was all coincidence. Others knew something had changed since Rachel's burial. The cemetery was no longer just for the resting. It had become a place where time held its breath, and even the air remembered. Martin, meanwhile, remained silent. He didn't deny the rumors, but he didn't feed them either. He knew that talking wouldn't bring anyone peace. And though he tried to forget, every time the sun slipped behind the hills of Pine Hollow, he heard that same soft voice echoing in his mind. "Help me." The day after Helen's burial, Martin returned to the cemetery. Not by choice, but out of obligation. He'd forgotten to hand Jenkins a document with the funeral details. He arrived early, hoping to be in and out. But as he pushed the rusted gate open, he came face to face with Elias Jenkins, the same gravedigger as always. Elias was even more hunched than before, hands stained with soil, eyes hidden under thick, weary brows. Yet when he saw Martin, something in his face tensed. He greeted him with a small nod and gestured for him to sit under the shade of a tall cypress. At first, their conversation was light. Weather, changes in town, how hard it is to grow old in silence. But it was Martin who, almost unintentionally, shifted the topic. He asked whether the cemetery had stayed as peaceful as before. Elias gave him a long look and said something that sent a chill down Martin's spine. "Nothing's been peaceful here since we buried Rachel." Martin dropped his gaze. No need to ask more, but Elias kept talking. He said that after Father Gregory's blessing, many people thought she had finally moved on, that things felt lighter, that the strange noises had stopped. But he knew better. He knew because the same tightness still pressed on his chest every time he passed her grave. "It's not like before, Martin. It's softer, but it's still there, like a presence that lingers because something's missing," Elias said, eyes fixed on the old walnut tree. Silence took hold for a moment. Then, almost in a whisper, Elias confessed something he'd never told anyone. "There's something carved behind her headstone. I saw it years ago but never said a word. No one else ever noticed," Elias said. Martin frowned. What does it say? Elias hesitated. His voice shook slightly when he finally spoke. Waiting for the last waltz. It was as if the air itself thickened around them. Martin felt his throat close up, not because of the words, but because it was as if something frozen in time had begun to fall, inch by inch, upon his shoulders. He said nothing else, just stood, shook Elias's hand in silence, and walked to the gate without looking back. That night at home, he opened the notebook he'd been writing in. He added a single line. Sometimes the dead don't ask for justice. They ask for the life they never finished living. Martin couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured those words etched behind the gravestone. Waiting for the last waltz. It was a simple phrase, yet it carried a weight he couldn't name. Who wrote it? When? Why had no one ever mentioned it before? Elias wasn't the kind to make things up. If he said it, it was because he saw it. The next day, Martin returned to the cemetery unannounced. He arrived mid-morning, when the sun had already begun to warm the stones, and the air felt heavier by the minute. He walked slowly, eyes down, pretending the memories flooding his mind weren't really there. When he reached Rachel's grave, he stopped. Everything was just as he remembered. Pale marble, sun-faded artificial flowers, and a small cross stuck in the soil. Nothing out of place. But Martin wasn't looking at what was visible. He circled the grave carefully, as if afraid to disturb something at rest. Reaching the back of the headstone, he crouched. At first, he saw nothing. Just a weathered surface, rough and worn by time. But as he leaned in, he noticed faint letters scratched in with something sharp, as if carved in haste. He ran his fingers over the grooves, tracing each line. The inscription was there, exactly as Elias had said, waiting for the last waltz. His stomach turned. He wasn't sure what he felt. Relief, maybe. Confirmation that it wasn't just some hallucination. But also a cold realization that what he'd lived that night hadn't been fear, nor the tricks of a tired mind. It had happened, and something or someone was still waiting. He sat down on the grass, under the shadow of the old walnut tree. The silence felt different, not the usual stillness of a graveyard, but something that watched. He remembered the white figure, the whisper that still haunted his sleep. Now it all made sense. She wasn't asking to leave. She wasn't begging for rest. She only wanted to finish what had been stolen from her. Her dance, her goodbye, her moment. Martin stayed there for over an hour, unmoving. He didn't pray, he didn't cry, he just thought. About the cruelty of dying while waiting, about how a soul could be trapped not by vengeance, but by longing. When he finally stood up, he looked once more at the headstone. The sun hit the stone just right, making the words shimmer briefly, like a warning not to forget. Back at home, he wrote in his notebook, "There's no worse fate than standing at the threshold, feet still, music gone." That grey afternoon, Mr. Carter, one of the town's oldest residents, knocked on Martin's door. He held his old hat in his hands and kept his gaze low. He never visited unannounced, and just his presence on the porch was a sign that something wasn't right. Martin opened the door without speaking. "Mrs. Turner wants to see you," Carter said softly. "She's not doing well. Says she can't go without speaking to you." Martin knew immediately who he meant, Rachel's mother. She lived in a small house across the road, facing the abandoned chapel. She had aged alone, with only a couple of hens and her daughter's photo hanging over a dusty altar. Martin hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He couldn't say no. They crossed town without a word. The wind carried the scent of burnt wood, and the streets, once filled with chatter, were eerily quiet, as if even the air sensed something important was about to be said. When they arrived, Carter pushed the door open and let Martin in. Mrs. Turner lay in a low bed, wrapped in a heavy blanket. Her face was gaunt, all skin and bone, but her eyes were still alive. When she saw Martin, she lifted one trembling hand. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I knew you would." Martin sat beside her. He didn't know what to say. She didn't let him think too long. "You were there," she murmured. "You saw her. No one else did. Just you." Martin swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, barely audible. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them again, with effort, and spoke. "My daughter." She didn't want to die that day. Everything was ready. The dress, the music, the food. All she wanted was to dance. That was her only wish. She didn't want to go without that. Martin's throat tightened. He understood more than he could explain, but what came next chilled him to his core. "She didn't leave," Mrs. Turner continued. "She stayed behind. I know it. She doesn't need prayers, Martin. She doesn't need mass. She just wants her dance, her final dance." Martin wanted to respond, but words wouldn't come. How do you fulfill a wish that doesn't belong to this world? Teresa took a deep breath, as if she sensed her time was running short. "You don't have to understand it. Just promise me. Don't let her go without what was stolen." Martin nodded. He didn't know how, but something inside him had already agreed before his mind could catch up. He rose quietly, kissed her hand, and left without a word. That night in his notebook he wrote a different kind of line. "Some souls don't seek peace. They seek what they were denied." Martin didn't talk to anyone about how he felt, but ever since his visit with Mrs. Turner, a quiet urgency had taken root inside him. It wasn't guilt or fear. It was a duty he didn't quite understand, but one that pressed against his chest with an ancient, invisible weight, like soil clinging to roots no one had noticed. That night, trying to sleep, he tossed under the sheets as if the bed no longer welcomed him. The air was thick, unmoving, and even the fan couldn't stir the curtains. Sometime after 2 in the morning, he finally closed his eyes. And then came the dream. In the dream, Martin stood in a grand, aging ballroom, lit only by tall candelabras. The floor was worn wood, and each step echoed with a hollow thud. At the far end, under a faint light, stood Rachel. She wore the same white dress, now spotless. The veil still covered her face, but she didn't feel like a ghost. She was waiting. Soft music floated in the air, slow, mournful, like the last song of a fading party. Rachel began to turn slowly, dancing with someone who wasn't there. Her feet moved as if they didn't touch the floor, and Martin stood still, watching from a distance, unable to move. When he finally tried to take a step toward her, the music stopped. Rachel stopped too. Slowly she turned her head toward him. Even though the veil remained, Martin felt her gaze. Then, with a voice not loud, but full enough to fill the entire room, she said, "I just want to dance." Martin woke with a start, throat dry, hands clammy. He sat up in bed, breathing hard, as if he'd run an endless race. He stared into the dark, and that's when he heard it. The old radio he'd stored away years ago, in a closet, batteries long dead, was playing a melody. It wasn't clear. It was faint, full of static, but it was the same music from his dream. He got up slowly, crossed the living room, and held it in his hands. The dial was off. No lights, just sound. He didn't know how long he stood there, listening, but when the melody finally faded, he understood what needed to be done. He didn't know how to organize a dance for a ghost, but it was clear. Something had been left unfinished, and unless that circle was closed, no soul, living or dead, would find rest. That dawn, his handwriting shaking, Martin wrote, "Sometimes the music no one hears is the one that hurts the most." He remembered that shortly after Rachel's burial, the family had requested a service at her grave. It wasn't a large gathering. Only a few people dared to attend. Father Gregory, visiting from St. Francis Parish, had accepted the request reluctantly. He wasn't a young priest, nor particularly superstitious, but something about the invitation unsettled him. The service took place on a Sunday at sunrise. It was barely past 6 when the priest arrived with a small Bible and a bottle of holy water. The sky was overcast, and oddly, the wind had completely disappeared. Elias witnessed the whole thing. Martin, no longer working there, only heard the account days later. Rachel had been laid to rest beside the walnut tree, off to the side of the cemetery. Father Gregory planted a small wooden cross in the soil and began to pray aloud, alternating between English and Latin. He sprinkled water in a circle, while the few attendees, including Mrs. Turner and two elderly women, clutched their rosaries and whispered prayers. And then it happened. According to Elias, in the middle of one prayer, the air grew heavy. A strange scent spread, hard to describe. Not rot, not incense, not flowers. It was a mixture of old perfume, melted wax, and wilted blooms. The women stirred. One dropped to her knees, clutching her chest. Rachel's mother began to cry. Father Gregory didn't stop. He raised his voice, lifting the cross toward the sky. Just as he said, "May the Lord receive your soul and release you from the shadow," a gust of wind swept through the cemetery. Dead leaves scattered. The Bible nearly flew from his hands, and everyone felt a sudden drop in temperature. What happened next was even more chilling. A thin, pale mist rose from the grave. It had no clear form, but those who saw it swore it hovered for a moment before fading completely into the air. Silence fell. Not even the birds nesting in the trees made a sound. At the end of the service, no one said a word. Each person left quietly, their steps slow, as if something unseen weighed down on them. Before getting into his car, Father Gregory walked over to Elias and said softly, "We did what we could. But some souls don't leave with words. They need deeds." Remembering that moment, Martin understood that the Mass had calmed the space, but not the heart that was still waiting. The promise he had made to Mrs. Turner wasn't symbolic. It was real, concrete, and he couldn't let it go unfulfilled. In the days that followed, Martin kept to himself, as if waiting for time to stop just long enough to offer an answer. Remembering wasn't enough. Understanding wasn't enough. He had made a promise to a dying mother, and more than that, to a young woman who died with a wish unfulfilled. He had to find a way to give her what kept her trapped between here and whatever comes after, her final waltz. So he went back to Elias, found him behind the cemetery, gathering his tools. Martin didn't have to explain much, just mentioned the dream, the music, and the hidden inscription behind the headstone. Elias stared at him in silence for a few moments, then nodded without question. He said he had an old record player at home, one that still worked. That very afternoon, he brought it out, along with a vintage waltz record that had belonged to his father. The plan was simple. It wasn't about invoking anything or challenging time. It was an act of respect, a symbolic gesture, but filled with meaning. Something that might allow Rachel to bring her story to a close. They prepared the space around her grave with care, removed the plastic flowers, cleaned the stone, and placed candles in a circle. No electricity, just firelight and silence. When night fell, Martin hooked up the record player to a portable battery. The needle dropped onto the vinyl, and a faint but steady melody filled the air. It was an old tune, one no one remembered, but that seemed to live in the memory of generations. It wasn't joyful or sad, just deep, human. Martin stood in front of the grave. Elias watched quietly from a distance. There was no audience, no prayers, only the music and the soft flickering of candle flames. For the first few moments, nothing happened. Then a warm breeze passed between them, like a breath that came from neither of them. The leaves of the walnut tree rustled gently, and a familiar scent, just like the one from the day of the service, returned to the air. There were no figures, no voices, only a feeling, profound and undeniable, that something was taking place. As if for a brief instant, the cemetery exhaled. Martin closed his eyes. He didn't imagine anything, didn't force a vision. He just let the music do what it needed to do. When the record ended, no one clapped. This wasn't a performance, it was an offering. Martin turned off the player, gathered the candles, and looked once more at the headstone. The inscription was still there, but for the first time it didn't feel like a plea, just a memory. That night back home, he wrote in his notebook, There are no ghosts where love was left undone, only absences still searching for their place. Martin never returned to the cemetery after that, not out of fear, but because something inside him knew it was no longer necessary. The air in town felt lighter. People stopped whispering about shadows or strange noises, or women in white crying in the trees. Elias confirmed days later that Rachel's grave remained clean, still, at peace, as if nothing more was pending. But the true change had occurred in Martin. He no longer woke in a sweat or heard that whisper echoing through his thoughts. Yet the story stayed with him. Not out of fear it would return, but because he now understood. Some presences aren't made of fear, but of absence. Of that kind of emptiness that time doesn't fill. Only meaning does. He began to write more often. Not for recognition, not for comfort. Just to record what he had seen, felt and lived. A truth that wasn't easy to share without being dismissed as an old man losing his grip. But he knew. He knew there are things you can't explain with logic or faith or science. Things that can only be understood by living through them. The record player stayed tucked in a corner of his living room. He never used it again. The notebook, though, kept filling. Page after page, with memories, sensations, and fragments of what he had come to learn. Sometimes he wrote sentences he didn't even know the origin of, as if someone else whispered them from the depths of his soul. One of them read, "Some farewells don't need words, only the exact gesture at the right moment." A few months later, Mrs. Turner passed away quietly in her home, as if she'd been waiting for that final act to complete her own story. Martin attended the wake. He didn't speak. He simply approached the casket, placed a single white flower, and left before the ceremony ended. From that day on, whenever the evening wind blew warm across town, Martin would open his window and sit beside it in silence, not waiting for anything. Just recognizing that sometimes the deepest stories aren't the ones that shout, but the ones that whisper. He never heard that melody again, never dreamed of Rachel. But within him, every step he took carried the same unshakable truth. Sometimes, even the dead need someone willing to listen without fear. There are wounds that no prayer and no passing time can heal, but an act rooted in meaning can. And so, with the weight of the years behind him, Martin Wallace lived in peace. Not because he forgot, but because he understood that when someone leaves without finishing their story, the silence they leave behind can be louder than any scream. And that listening, sometimes, is the only way to help.